Disclaimer before we get started. We're going to be talking about different parts of evolutionary theory tonight. And in order to avoid saying, "so they say," every time I mention a date that is an age estimate for the earth that's older than Scripture would allow, just presume I am saying, "so they say." It'll save us a lot of time.
Yeah.
Quick review for people who missed last week. In order for evolution to be true, it has to do 5 things. It has to explain the beginning of life. That is how you go from simple materials that are not living to some sort of living thing, whether that be a cell or a bacteria or whatever. You have to have a method for the development of life, how it goes from that very simple beginning to cell structure, or the structure of the cell, multi-celled organisms, and so on. You have to account for speciation, that is, put simply, dogs and cats, and lions and tigers and bears, oh my. All of these things. The fact that we have many different types, different kinds of animals. You have to account for the development of intelligence. Although the evolutionist, the materialist, will say that no, that's simply something that arises naturally. And then also consciousness. That is, and the difference between consciousness and intelligence is the difference between, as I explained last week, my cat knowing that when I pull the tab on the can, that means it's time to eat. He has that knowledge and just automatically knows. He hears that noise come running. And the ability to reflect on who I am, which my cat does not have. My cat has intelligence. My cat does not have consciousness. He cannot reflect on who he is as a cat. And again, the materialist will say that these last two are just a function of the neurons firing in the brain, but that's an assumption. They have no evidence of that. And there are some now who are saying that in fact evolution is wholly unqualified to account for these things, even if it can account for life. With that in mind, we looked at Darwin, who, in his Origin of Species, explains how different functions could arise randomly or by natural selection, but does not explain how information arises, because function is different than information. And in the 20th century, we discovered that at its base, life is information, not just functions. And we're going to talk about that more tonight. But with regard to how information arises, no model has been given for how information can arise. The only one that I know of that has tried, which is what we talked about last week, is Richard Dawkins in his book Blind Watchmaker, tries to explain that. Does not do a very good job, again, as we talked about last week. When we talk about life, and when evolutionists speak about life, they'll often talk about the building blocks of life and the origin of the building blocks of life. In much the same way that when I ordered my garage from the lumber yard, each 2x4, each box of nails, each whatever else they sent, is a building block of the garage. But when they delivered it, they did not deliver a garage. They delivered about 3 pallets of shrink-wrapped materials on my lawn and a whole bunch of trusses. And it was up to me to put it together. Fortunately, it wasn't actually up to me to put it together. I had someone who came out and helped me with that. Now, I even had a sheet of directions for how to put it together, but you look at the directions and you look at this pile and you just kind of go, uh-oh. And so I asked the guy who was helping put it together, my brother-in-law was helping, and I asked him, I said, does this make any sense? He was like, oh yeah, that pile makes all sorts of sense to me. I'm like, good, because it's just a pile to me. Okay, I had the building blocks for a garage, but I did not yet have a garage. I had a mess on my lawn. It took someone who knew how to structure that in the correct way to turn it into a garage. And so building blocks does not equal the thing that they are the building blocks of. And now we come to DNA. Because when we start talking about the building blocks of life, in evolutionary theory, that's the amino acid. And amino acids come together to form DNA. DNA is the stuff in our cells that tells our cells what to do, defines who we are. DNA is unraveled in the early 1950s by Watson and Crick. They figure out that it forms a double helix pattern, and I have a nice little sample picture of it right here that you can see. That's a very simplified model of what DNA is, and it's these amino acids in pairs. The cytosine goes with the guanine, the adenine with the thymine. They match up. And the different matches is information, like in a computer, the ones and zeros. They add up to information. And then this is the sugar backbone, or the phosphate sugar backbone, it's sometimes called, or just the backbone of DNA, the deoxyribose backbone. There's all sorts of different names, different ways of referring to it, but it's the backbone of DNA. And the amino acids are the building blocks of DNA. DNA is made out of them. As I mentioned last week, Darwin doesn't address this at all. He doesn't address genetics at all, because the study of genetics arises in the late 1800s under Mendel. He's the first one, and he has experiments with different types of peas in his garden to determine how genetic traits are actually passed on. In the 1950s, we finally discover that it's actually this double helix pattern with these 4 different base pairs. The human genome is not entirely sequenced, where they actually unravel all of it and look and see what's there, until 2006, which is to say we're still learning how DNA works. And when we look at what Darwin or Dawkins do, they cannot explain the fact that DNA is ultimately information. Dawkins tries to explain how life could have arisen in the primordial soup. And in order to take a look at what he tries to do, we need to look at another experiment that was done in the 50s, the very famous Miller experiment. And this is included in every biology textbook as how life arose. What he did was, they took the gases that they thought were in the atmosphere at this time, back in the pre-life days of the Earth. A whole bunch of toxic ones, ammonia, sulfur dioxide. The thought was that volcanoes were spewing out these kind of toxic chemicals. Put them in a flask or a closed system and then ran electric currents through it to simulate lightning. They ended up with gunk. But when they looked at the gunk, they found amino acids. These things, the building blocks. And so if you read a biology textbook today, it will talk about the Miller experiment and say that it was proven that in the early atmosphere, the building blocks of life could have formed. Now let's skip to the difference between horses and giraffes. That, again, is the same effect as me having the garage delivered and then skipping to the part where I park my car in it. You've got to have something before that. There exist more than 4 of these amino acids, but these are the only 4 that are used for coding the DNA. The basic theory is, and there's variations on this theory, but the basic theory is you have these amino acids form, and then somehow they come together and form chains. And the chains somehow start making copies of themselves, because that's what DNA does. DNA unravels. RNA comes into it too. There's a lot more to it than this, but the basic concept is it unravels, and then half of this, because cytosine always goes with guanine, adenine with thymine, so if you have one set, it splits in the middle. You have one set, and then it can duplicate from that. It actually goes from the one set, as it comes apart, to the RNA, and then the RNA is where the copies are made that then form new DNA. So it's not actually as simple as DNA just copying itself. There's more steps to it than that, a lot more. But basically the idea is you have these pairs coming together randomly, and then they can replicate themselves. It's theoretically possible, I suppose, if you had a bunch of Tinker Toys and you had 1 billion years to shake them, that they would randomly come together to form a structure like this. And my contention is that a lot of selling evolution has to do with how we present it. Because this is not that complicated a structure in the whole grand scheme of things, when you look at it. And this could theoretically arise. For the record, I counted there are 18 base pairs on this strand of DNA. The simplest cell, or the simplest genome that they have coded is actually, on a different page, is actually 159,662 base pairs. This is 18.
Could you repeat that figure again, please?
It's Carcinella rudii. It's a bacterial parasite that lives symbiotically with a jumping louse. And I have it written down later, and I'm not sure where that is, and I don't know why I wrote it down later. But that's the shortest, the simplest genome that they have yet sequenced.
That's how many pairs?
159,662. For comparison, Supposing, and this actually takes up a little more space, but supposing this takes up about 7 inches on a piece of paper. I figured it for 8.5 by 11 sheet. This is 8.5 by 14, but we'll shrink it a little bit. Supposing this takes up 7 inches. At this scale, the genome sequence for Carcinella rudii, if you printed it out, would be 62,090 inches long, which is just about 100 feet short of a mile. It starts to look less likely. And in fact, this arising randomly starts to look less likely when we stop just saying sugar phosphate backbone and we start actually showing what the atomic structure is. Same thing. Simplified, the entire atomic structure shown. This sugar backbone, it's sugar phosphate backbone. It's sugars and phosphates come together in a very specific pattern that from one side to the other is flipped. It's actually quite complex, even this back. It's not just simple. When you say backbone, it's not this simple thing. It's a very specific chemical structure that goes one direction on one and the other direction on the other side. And so when we start looking at what DNA actually is, we're not looking, as we talked about last week, at a 29-letter sentence or at an 18 base pair Tinker Toy model. We're looking at something that is extremely complicated. Dawkins tries to deal with this and suggests that in a universe as large as ours, he estimates there to be 100 billion planets that would theoretically be capable of supporting or evolving life. 100 billion planets have conditions where life could theoretically form. And between the time the planets in general formed and now, we have about 5 billion years to work with. So, if you multiply those two together, the number of planets times the number of years available, you have 5 sextillion planet years in which to have life randomly begin. And, because here we are, it only needs to happen once, he says. And so he starts to get the idea that because of these numbers, the odds are actually quite likely. But listen to how he describes this process. My personal feeling is that once cumulative selection has got itself properly started, we need to postulate only a relatively small amount of luck in the subsequent evolution of life and intelligence. Cumulative selection, once it has begun, seems to me powerful enough to make the evolution of intelligence probable, if not inevitable. And then farther down on that same page. But although we are entitled in our theory of the origin of life to spend a maximum ration of luck, amounting perhaps to odds of 100 billion to 1 against, my hunch is that we aren't going to need more than a small fraction of that ration. Now, on one page where he's discussing how life could have happened, my personal feeling seems to me, my hunch is, again, we're out of the realm of science. On the next page, the word speculate has pejorative overtones, but these are quite uncalled for here. We can hope for nothing more than speculation when the events we are talking about took place 4 billion years ago, and took place, moreover, in a world that must have been radically different from that which we know today. For instance, there was almost certainly no free oxygen in the atmosphere. Let's talk about that last statement, in addition to his attempt to say, no, we can totally speculate about whatever we want back then. It's 4 billion years ago. Again, this is not, even for someone who is an absolute apostle of the glories of evolution, not sounding like science. The whole fact thing, when you actually get down to it, ends up being mere speculation about things we have no idea about.
He actually has an oxymoron in that statement.
Yeah.
Almost certainly.
Right.
Certainly is not almost.
Right. Yeah. 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 And when we talk about the early atmosphere of the Earth, I mentioned that before. Again, the idea of volcanoes are erupting, they're giving off these toxic gases, and the assumption is always that you have all these other gases, but not oxygen. Why is that? One might ask. I know I was puzzled by that. Very simple. The presence of oxygen ruins the Miller experiment. That is to say, amino acids will not form if oxygen is present. They simply won't. Or it is far less likely that they will form. It's possible you might get some. You would not get them in concentrations high enough to be statistically significant. So the assumption is that oxygen was not present, because if oxygen was present, the amino acids wouldn't have formed. But you see, now our assumptions are driving our facts. Not the other way around. It had to happen this way, because if it didn't, we would have to admit that life is impossible without the presence of God, which is, as we talked about last week, the fundamental presupposition that God does not exist. And since God is not there, it must have been this way. No evidence for it, other than they reject God as their primary assumption, which is not a scientific assumption, it is a theological one. Richard Dawkins seems to think that these 5 sextillion planet years is enough, because if you look at all those zeros, that's hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions, quintillions, sextillion. Each one of those is 3, so we're looking at a lot of zeros. And he says it only needs to happen once. And so no matter how long the odds are, he says, we have just a tremendous number of chances for it to happen. The problem is, it's still not enough time to form information. As we talked about last week, how long it would take for information to randomly arise. And so now we're not arguing over scientific fact, we're arguing over, or he's trying to defend the likelihood of this even happening. But again, that's not scientific inquiry. It's really metaphysical, philosophical inquiry at this point. And all of this is conjecture. That's one of the problems with this, is we don't have evidence of the atmosphere back then. Our evidence has more to do with what would be necessary than what anything is showing us actually occurred. We're reconstructing this atmosphere, we're reconstructing the conditions at this time based on what would have been necessary. And what was necessary was no oxygen. The other problem is that the amino acids have to come together to create the DNA and come together to create proteins. The problem is that proteins break down in water, they don't form. And while there are various different debates on the topic, there's no consensus as to how that could happen then. And in fact, there are many scientists who have said, we simply cannot explain how it happened, that you go from amino acids to proteins. Because you have to get that step from amino acid to protein. Okay, if amino acid is the building block, protein is the wall of your building. That's a problem. If you go to the lumber yard and order your house and say, deliver it to my front lawn, and then when you're checking out, they say, will that be cash or charge? And you say, we'll figure that out later. They're not going to deliver your house. You have to have some method in mind of payment that they will accept. You have to have that answer or your whole building project falls apart. That's what we have here. We have fundamentally no idea how it is that even if these building blocks were formed, they then came together. The other thing is that scientists are fairly certain now that the atmosphere in that Watson and Crick thought, not Watson and Crick, that Miller thought was in use, was not the atmosphere that was actually there. And so we have all these ideas about how you could have gotten so far, and then from there, magically to success. We talked about DNA. I think if they put this model into textbooks, people would go, well, that's just crazy. That can't arise randomly. This, like I say, a billion years shaking Tinker Toys in a box, I could see. This, I think people would go, wow, that's pretty complicated stuff. What told it to do that? I could shake my Tinker Toys for more than a billion years. I don't think I'd get that. And when we actually look at what it is that has been constructed, it gets even harder to explain. Again, we talked about the simplest genomes that we know about is roughly 150,000 of these base pairs. It's a bacteria that lives in the jumping plant louse. That's the name of it. There we go. That's for a simple bacteria. 150,000, basically, or 150K of information. 150,000 little bits. For the fruit fly, they've sequenced the genome of the fruit fly. 16 megabytes. 16 million of these. The human genome, 3.2 gigabytes. Now, again, when we start writing out these numbers, 150,000, that's a pretty big number. This is even bigger. And, oh, not 3.2. Was it 16? And an extra 0. And then humanity is 3.2. Gigabytes. That's what we're talking about. And so when they use the word building blocks to describe amino acids, that's equivalent to saying, with regard to the very simplest genome known so far, that one rivet is a building block for the Golden Gate Bridge. Or actually, a quarter of a tower of the Golden Gate Bridge. For the simplest cell they've been able to discover. Okay, you use rivets to hold together, right? They're the building blocks of structures. To say that these amino acids are the building blocks of life with regard to, for example, the fruit fly, would be to say that a rivet is the building block of 14 Golden Gate bridges. To say that the amino acid is the building block of life would be, with regard to humanity, would be equivalent to saying a rivet is the building block of 2,800 Golden Gate bridges. This is a tremendous amount of information. Now, don't get me wrong, you can't build the Golden Gate Bridge without 600,000 rivets for each one of those towers. It is true, that is the building block of the Golden Gate Bridge. But Dawkins says, in that quote I read, says that once you have life started, you're naturally going to arise to this. Dawkins basically is claiming that once you have discovered the rivet, it automatically follows that you're going to build 2,800 Golden Gate bridges. You're going to need a whole lot of planning, design, and effort. Planning and design. You need a whole bunch of them. Because if you do it even a little bit wrong, you don't end up with the Golden Gate Bridge. You end up with, have you ever seen those video clips of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge that was built back in the 40s? And they built it so that it set up a standing wave between the towers. It was just the perfect length so that vibrations in the bridge from the wind coming down didn't get canceled. They amplified themselves in the structure of the bridge. And so there's these videos of the bridge doing this until finally the bridge goes down into the river below. Fortunately, no one was killed, although a dog died. But there was a dog on the bridge at the time. But no one was actually killed. Everybody got off the bridge in time. You can see on the film loop of it, these people getting out of their cars in the middle of the bridge and just running for the end. It doesn't take much to get something very, very, very wrong when it comes to engineering. Everything has to be exactly right for it to work. This is the problem we have. Another comparison. The average house, they say, uses around 12,000 nails. If we call the cell, or we call the amino acid the building block of life, and say it arose randomly, that's like saying that I've invented the nail, and therefore the city of Denver will naturally arise. That's how many houses we're talking about. Roughly 286,000 houses at 12,000 nails per house. Just because you have enough nails to build a city does not mean you in fact have a city. You have to have more to it than that. It just doesn't work. Informationally, when you look at the information contained in the cell, it simply stops working. And I mentioned last time that statisticians generally don't comment on evolution, on the chances of evolution actually happening. One recently did, and it was published by Cornell University. And I don't have the paper. I had printed the article, but it's interesting. What they did was, with regard to computers, there's a rule. It's called Moore's Law. and it says every 2 years computing power doubles. So 2 years ago, we had half the computing power we have today in our computers. 2 years before that, half the computing power 2 years before that, and so on. And it actually holds fairly consistently. Now, it used to be that that was great for computer manufacturers back in the late 80s and early 90s when everyone was kind of getting on board, because you'd have a computer, and of course the minute you got it home it was outdated, and then you'd suffer with this outdated computer for 2 years, and then you'd go buy another one that would run the newest and latest software, and then would be outdated in 2 more years. We've gotten to a point with computers now where even despite their continuing to double in capacity every 2 years, that's actually shortening a little bit, the computer's still useful and functional, and so people are keeping computers longer, much to the chagrin of people like Dell and Hewlett-Packard, who were very excited selling a new computer every 2 years. But if you follow that back, you end up with computers actually arising somewhere in the late 50s, early 60s, which is when the first microprocessor was invented in 1962, and when computers started being made. And since then, every 2 years, computing power doubles. These statisticians, using Moore's law, looked historically at the fossil record for genetic complexity. Starting with today, with the genetic diversity and the complexity we've been talking about, okay, these numbers, the different different species with very complex amounts of DNA. And you go back and find how far you have to go back in the fossil record to find animals that would have had half the complexity, and how far you would have had to go back for half of that. And they did this all the way until the fossils stopped. But when the fossils stop, you still have a tremendous amount of genetic complexity. But they were able to extrapolate, based on Moore's law, the idea that you have as a constant a progression of doubling. They then worked backwards from when the fossils stopped to figure out how far back you would have to go for the beginning of life. To get back to the beginning, it was 9.7 billion years. Now, the good news is, for evolutionists, the age of the universe is 13.82 billion years. Okay, so we're under the age of the universe. This isn't nearly as embarrassing as in the 1990s when they discovered stars that were 5 billion years older than the universe. They had to reconfigure how they measured and aged stars and make all the numbers match. So it is technically younger than the age of the universe. The problem is, the age of the Earth is only 4.5 billion years. So you have life arising 4.5 billion years before the Earth is there, in order for it to progress to the point we have now. That's a statistician's take, merely on the genetic complexity we have on our planet, not on the odds of it arising. Okay, they still have not commented. There's still been no statistical analysis of the odds of Dawkins' theories actually happening, because you can't measure odds that low. But even with the information we do have, projecting back, it takes twice as long as the age of the Earth for life to get to where it is now. That's a problem. Now, some are saying, this is great news. It means life originated in outer space and arrived on a meteor. You'll sometimes hear those sorts of theories. Now, there's actually a theory that life somehow originated on Mars and then got blasted here by some cosmic explosion. I don't make this stuff up. This is what they're saying. there are problems with this whole information idea. That is to say, we have information. How did it get here? We can't explain how it got here. And that's a big problem. That's a very big problem because evolution depends on it. It can't arise without that. Or I should say life can't arise without some explanation of how the information got there. Now, when we look at our 4.5 billion year old world, our 13.82 billion year old universe, you notice that the Earth has only been around for about the last third of the universe's existence. You had almost 8 or 9 billion years with no Earth. Which is to say, most of the time in our universe has been spent getting ready for life. And evolutionists are saying that life arose originally 3.5 billion years ago. I think for the most part, they're discounting the statistical analysis that was done as just kind of a fanciful sort of thing, but not really applicable because it's hypothetical. They're speculating. When Dawkins does it, it's science. When statisticians do it and make them look bad, it's just a flight of fancy. I am not a physicist, and so as we talk about some of these things, I'm actually going to be quoting Robert Newman from the book Evidence for Faith, which is an excellent, excellent book. It's Deciding the God Question, and these are various essays by different people regarding how the universe got here. When we look at physics, you may remember from school learning about Newton's 3 laws, that an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Force equals mass times acceleration, and for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. You may remember those sorts of things. It has been discovered in centuries since then, 4 fundamental forces in the universe. Gravity, which we're all familiar with. I have a love-hate relationship with gravity. Electromagnetism. And then the strong and weak nuclear forces. They don't really need to concern us in what we're talking about here. They're not effective once you get much past the atomic level. When you are at the atomic level, they are so strong that gravity and electromagnetism basically stop being in the equation. Gravity, they don't even figure it at that level because it's such a small force. But the strong and weak nuclear forces are very short distance things, only, like I say, at the atomic or subatomic level. Gravity, the one that affects us most, is the weakest of the forces. The reason that it affects us most is we live on this big ball called Earth. It has lots of mass. Gravity and electromagnetism are both infinite. That is, their effects continue on through the entire universe. It diminishes, but never entirely goes away. With regard to electromagnetism, it's much stronger than gravity. But because there is an almost equal number of positive and negatively charged particles in the universe, remember protons and electrons, that cancels itself out. But it's much stronger than gravity. The entire gravitational force of the planet can be counteracted with a small magnet. Right? You can hold a magnet and put a pin on it, and the pin's held up. I was actually going to bring a magnet and a pin to show you that, but I forgot. So just pretend I have a magnet and a pin. The pin is held up. That is to say, the force of this magnet is stronger than the force of the entire Earth pulling the pin downwards. Gravity has effects over very long distances. And this becomes important because they used to think the universe was always kind of staying the same, neither expanding nor contracting. They know now the universe is expanding at this point. They don't know whether it will continue doing that forever or whether eventually the force of gravity will be enough to pull it back. They're not sure about that. I read some articles on this. They said that some people were saying it would take 100 years of radio telescope data to try to specifically looking for this to solve that problem. One guy thinks he can do it in 20 years. Or even, I think I saw a thing where he said it's possible even in 5. No, they think they've got the equations worked out. But we don't know if the universe is just going to keep getting bigger or if at some point all that gravity will start pulling it back towards itself. If it does start pulling it back towards itself, the universe will end as it began in the Big Bang. And I've been using all of these terms for so long, I just have to add remind you of the "so they say" disclaimer. Just insert that into all of this. When the universe begins, the entire universe is shrunk down to a point smaller than the size of an atom. It's called a singularity. And in science, when you have a singularity, it's something past which you can't speculate. In physics, the entire universe back into a point. Or black holes. Those are also called sometimes singularities. Because the laws as we know it break down and we can't ponder what happened before the Big Bang. We can't even guess. In math, a singularity is when you try to divide by 0. Everything goes haywire. You just can't do it. Math says this is something we cannot do. The question that I would like to ask evolutionists is, and this isn't from me, this is from, I originally heard it from Dr. Kurt Marquardt, of blessed memory. He said, physics, math can recognize singularities. Number one, can biology recognize a biological singularity? That is, a point past which we cannot speculate. Do they recognize the existence of them biologically? Because in the other sciences, they do. And number two, if they will recognize that they exist, how would you know one when you see one? And these are because we've hit upon a number of them. And Dawkins is kind of hinting at their existence but refuses to admit it. Well, I think this is what it could be. He himself admitted, well, we're just speculating now. We really don't know. And we can't know, he said. That would be a biological singularity. And in this case, the singularity is how life began. And they just don't know. With regard to our expanding universe after the Big Bang, plenty of time. Again, the entire universe was in an infinitesimal spot, infinitely dense, and at the Big Bang began expanding rapidly. And this is where I'm going to have to end up quoting Newman. If we start looking at the state of the universe at various times, if the universe is too dense, as I mentioned, it will eventually go back on itself. If the universe is not dense enough, had the universe not been dense enough, we wouldn't have had planets form because matter would have expanded too rapidly for gravity to have any effect. We actually have, now you could add a planet or two and it wouldn't really affect the overall gravitational pull of the entire universe because it's so spread out, there's so much there. But when you get closer and closer to the Big Bang, things have to be fairly finely tuned. It's roughly equivalent to if you're shooting something that's, if you're out hunting and you want to shoot something that's 100 yards away, the margin of error is a lot better than if you're trying to shoot something that's 1,000 yards away. Now all of a sudden, you have to be a really good shot. And when we talk about Army snipers, you know, hitting their targets 2-3 miles away, everyone kind of goes, wow. Because you have to be so precise with where the bullet's leaving to hit there. Now, when you're only 100 yards out, you've got, right, a much larger margin of error. Well, with regard to the universe, right now, again, add a planet or two, it doesn't matter. But if we go back to a point 10 to the negative 43 seconds after the Big Bang, this is called Planck time. It's the smallest conceivable amount of time. It's 0.042 more zeros, 1 seconds after the Big Bang. And the way they figure, the guy who came up with this is, that's the smallest conceivable unit of time. And the distance that light can travel in that time is the smallest conceivable distance, according to scientists. Anything less than that doesn't matter, or whatever. Again, I'm not that much into physics that I'm able to understand why that's significant. But that is what they say. And if we go back to this point, at 0.042 more zeros, 1 seconds after the Big Bang, Planck time, Robert Newman says this: for the density to be even so close after 20 billion years of expansion, or 15 billion years of expansion, this was written quite some time ago. The universe is younger now than it was in the early 1990s. It must have been very precisely tuned in the earliest moments after the Big Bang. At 10 to the negative 43 seconds after the Big Bang, for instance, the so-called Planck time, the density must have been equal to the critical density, so that, again, it wouldn't just collapse back in on itself and wouldn't expand forever without forming planets, to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the negative 55. That's how finely tuned the density had to be. The practical effects of this fine-tuning are two. If the density had been ever so slightly higher, the universe would have collapsed quickly. Instead of lasting some 20 billion years, there would never have been an opportunity for life to form. On the other hand, had the density been ever so much slightly smaller, the universe would have expanded much more rapidly than it did, and no galaxy, stars, or planet would have formed. Again, no life. Life is the result of fine-tuning the density of matter energy at the Planck time to 1 part in 10 to the 55th power. Again, that's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. That's how finely tuned the what did he call it? The matter energy density of the universe was. When we look at these numbers of how finely tuned the universe has to be, we find that they are almost comically precise. You couldn't get this randomly. For example, the planet Earth, if it were 5% closer to the sun, this also comes from Robert Newman, it would have been warmer early on. And what would have happened was it would have been just enough warmer that you would have had a larger greenhouse effect with the water in the early atmosphere that would have run away, and the surface of Earth would now be like the surface of Venus, where it is 900 degrees. The surface of Venus is actually warmer than the surface of Mercury because of this. If the Earth had been 1% farther away, 2 billion years ago, there would have been a runaway ice age, and there would be no life. That's how precisely fine-tuned the planet or the orbit of our planet is. Because again, when you're looking at these, if the Earth were moved 5% closer to the sun, it wouldn't actually probably be that noticeable right away. In fact, interesting little statistic, the Earth is 1 million miles closer to the sun in the winter than in the summer. The reason it's colder is because, of course, the angle that the sun hits us is lower in the winter. But we're actually closer to the sun now than we are in the summer. So at this point, it would not be immediately noticeable. But when you look at cumulative effects over billions of years, you end up with things that no longer work. When you consider the fine-tuning of our planet, even today, we have a planet that goes below freezing in the winter, but not so much that all of the water ever freezes. That's actually fairly impressive when you think about it. Even at its coldest, the Great Lakes don't freeze all the way across. And then in the summer, of course, they all melt. But they don't get so hot that they boil, which would be rather a problem, obviously. Our planet temperature is in a very narrow band. And again, to give you an idea, when the Apollo spacecraft went to the moon, they had to do what they called a barbecue roll. They would set it so that the spacecraft would rotate constantly all the way there. Because if it didn't, one side of the spacecraft, the one that was getting hit with the sunlight, all of the equipment there would get fried. All of the equipment on the other side would freeze. This is the problem on the planet of the moon. The surface of the moon is that it's hundreds and hundreds of degrees in the sun, negative hundreds of degrees on the shady side. It's not that way here because the atmosphere of Earth regulates it, those temperatures. And the oceans help to regulate those temperatures as well. The extreme distance from the ocean, in Minnesota, for example, you'll sometimes have hotter days in the summer in Minnesota than in Texas. Because Texas is closer to the ocean. That's how the currents are running. You can get very hot weather quite a long ways north because you don't have water moderating. Even something as simple as that. The rules of our universe, not just our planet, but the whole universe, the physical rules that govern the universe are so finely tuned, so delicately balanced from a physics perspective that there is now a theory that physicists are trying out that there are infinite multiple universes. And the reason they're saying that this is possibly true is for no other reason than, with no other evidence than, the fine-tuning of our universe could not have arisen randomly. And so, because our universe is so finely tuned, there must be other universes where things aren't as good, where planets don't form quite as nicely, where things just collapse back in on itself, where the four fundamental forces don't agree quite so nicely to give us this universe we have. Because there's no actual reason why the laws of physics should be so finely balanced as they are, as opposed to some other law that's just slightly different. As I said, in one case, 10 to the 55th power. That's pretty finely balanced. And the only reason for this multiverse theory is because they no longer think that the physical laws we have in our universe could have arisen naturally, if this was the only shot at doing so. And of course, the reason that we would need these multiple universes is because the one thing that could not have caused all of these finely tuned rules is a supreme being. Because that is, again, the fundamental presupposition behind all of this. And that's going to drive all of our theories, such that anything that requires that will be rejected out of hand in favor of other theories that get increasingly ludicrous the more we learn about the universe. Next week, we will bring all of this together and draw some conclusions. Oh, and here's the article, if anyone wants to see it, on that statistical study that was, out of Cornell University. This was published in a peer-reviewed journal. This isn't some quack who said, look at what I just discovered on my Excel spreadsheet. This was an actual scientific analysis that was done and published in a peer-reviewed journal. Again, according to this, the universe is, or the life on Earth is older than the Earth. And that's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem. So, I say the problems keep coming. Next week we're going to look at the philosophies behind a lot of this, what the consequences are, one way or another, and some of those things. So, a little bit less sciencey and more philosophical next week. Any questions? Everyone's kind of...
With this evolution theory, they never ever went back into any of the early life that they are finding in the rocks and whatnot and figured out how much it has changed or would have changed or anything like that.
Well, the problem you have is once you get into fossils, you can only examine the shape. Because fossils don't have DNA, essentially. And so there's no way to really test anything beyond the shape that is preserved in the fossils. So there's really not much else they can discover. A lot of it at that point becomes hypothetical.
Which, as far as I'm concerned, everything else is.
Everything has been, yeah. I did, and I forgot to mention one other thing. When they first started looking at DNA, now if you have evolution, you have things slowly coming into being, and you're going to have, as we talked about, different kinds of experiments that don't work with regard to natural selection and others that do. And you would expect by the time you get to humans, you're going to have a lot of extra information in there that's no longer needed. And they call this junk DNA. And that was that if Darwin's correct, there should be a lot of junk DNA. It turns out there is. There's a lot of DNA that's not needed for coding the human person. And so evolutionists were thrilled to discover this and were exultant through the 1980s and into the 1990s until they started discovering that this so-called junk DNA, as it were, actually has a lot to do with how the DNA works. It's, to some extent, not information that the DNA uses to run the liver, make the organs and so on. It's information the DNA uses to run itself. And that's a problem. Let's see if I can find, I have some, let's see, I can't find any of my notes on that. But they've actually discovered that DNA has multiple structures, file structures, like on your computer hard drive, where you have like the folder and then the folders, and where they've it's incredibly complex, and this so-called junk DNA really isn't junk at all. It's just, oh, here it is. It directs the timing and regulation of DNA coding regions, that is, the DNA that does replicate and tell cells what to do. The junk DNA works to correct errors. Again, you've got hierarchical file folder system, distributed storage and retrieval informational modules. In addition to, and this is my favorite, nested coding of information. That is to say, information that's there, but can be read to do two different things. So there's a code in the information itself that it's doing things, but it can also do something else. Like if you read a book with a secret code in the book, kind of a thing. DNA is sophisticated at that level. And so the idea of junk DNA, which again was a big deal in the 1980s for evolutionists, they're not talking about it anymore. Because it's not just leftover, it's telling the DNA how to do its job. That's all information.
Pastor,
Yes.
so what is in the science book at the middle school or the high school? I mean, how much of this is, because they're not telling all these kids about all this stuff, are they?
Well, no.
Yes.
No. Well, they're not telling them about, they're not giving them these sorts of numbers. They learn about the adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. They learn about DNA as a double helix with the...
So they're spoon feeding them bits of
There,
information.
yeah, and you'll see a diagram like this. You won't see a diagram that's a mile long. A fold out of an actual DNA sequence for the simplest bacteria. Obviously, it wouldn't fit in the book, but it wouldn't serve the purpose of making them think it could happen.
So
They do admit the Miller experiment is no longer seen as how the universe gets there, but again, they say, amino acids, building blocks of life, without ever giving any sort of thought as to how it got from, building blocks to a structure being there. And so they teach selectively, very selectively, and that is by judicial fiat, as I like to say. That has nothing to do with evidence one way or another. It's what they have been told they are allowed to teach. And so far, the very idea that there might be a designer behind all of this has been forbidden. They can only teach, and this is why, and we'll talk about this next week, the idea of theistic evolution. But they can only teach materialistic evolution, non-theistic evolution, atheistic evolution. That's all that can be taught. That's, again, it's a religion. And those who question it are immediately excluded from the circle of renowned scientists. By definition, they have to be. Because if they're not, now we get into kind of what we're covering next week. You have to admit the existence of God. Like I said, that's the one thing they cannot do. So, but yeah, this is basically what we've covered of evolution is basically what's taught there. I've gone into some more detail in some respects with Dawkins' theories and such as he tries to explain it. But the basic theory I've taught here is what's being taught in our schools. And not just our schools here. That's any school that uses a secular textbook.
A question.
Yes.
It's true to large extent, scientists, if some scientists suddenly start believing the supreme being, they try to,
Right.
But how do they account for Einstein, who's considered the greatest scientist of all time and very definitely to be believed in a supreme being?
Well, there's some question about that as to how much he did. He didn't seem to speculate on it too much, and I don't think he especially cared one way or the other. When you actually look at some of the quotes in larger context, a lot of times you'll find little quotes on the internet and stories, but I don't think it was of great concern to him as such. Now, a bigger question is, because as brilliant as Einstein is, Newton is every bit as brilliant. And Newton was a Christian, explicitly so. They simply disregard that as a byproduct of a former age.
Something that can't be explained.
Yeah, why Newton would have been a Christian. You know, if only he could have been around today, he could have cast off those chains, and then he could have really done something with his life. Rather than being the inventor of Newtonian physics and calculus. You know, that's, and so...
But did you know, though, that the Mayo's Clinic officially takes a stand that a God exists?
I did not know that.
Yeah, and that they believe very strongly in the power of prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are certainly scientists in there.
Yeah, this is the question, and this is, I don't think, this wasn't really on the list for next week, but, so I'm not giving anything away, but when you talk about this, evolutionists say, you know, in order to properly do science, you have to accept evolution. When the actual truth is that evolutionary science only affects evolutionary science. It has nothing at all to do with physics. It doesn't matter in the remotest, your views on the origin of the universe, if you're studying things at that Large Hadron, I'm pronouncing it wrong, collider in Bern, Switzerland, where they run particles into each other and try and figure out the, you know, it doesn't matter how you think the universe got here. I have a friend he's a pastor now. He was a nuclear geologist. He said, the company I worked for didn't care what I thought about the origin of the universe. They just wanted to know if I could find uranium. So they really don't, and when, in medicine, for example, evolutionary theory, which is supposed to be the key to unlocking life, has practically nothing to say about development of new treatments, new medicines, nothing. And so evolutionary theory, which is supposed to be the key on which all others are based, really only affects evolutionary science. It doesn't even really affect medicine. It affects evolutionary biology. It has nothing to say to physics or chemistry or mathematics, and very little to say to biology in a practical sense, that is the study of medicine. And so you can be an outright creationist and work for drug testing companies. They don't care. They just want to know if you're good at designing and testing new drugs. They don't care your theories on the origin of how it got there. But as soon as you go into the academic setting, this is how it must be, or you are simply mocked. One of the real great defenders of Scripture, Dr. David Menton, I have some of his videos here. They're actually quite good. He was a professor at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. He's retired now. He works for the Creation Institute. He taught at medical school. And he's a 6-day creationist. And it didn't matter in the slightest, because he wasn't teaching things that have to do with evolution. He was teaching future doctors how to deal with things of the body and anatomy, and that had actually nothing to do with evolution at all. And so the claims of evolutionists that in order to be a proper scientist you have to accept evolution is really just evolutionary biologists trying to improve their own standing scientifically. Yeah, that's really what it is. So, all right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Next week we will conclude, like I said, look at philosophical implications of all this mess.